I have decided to subtitle this presentation Painful Antecedents, Changing Futures to indicate Yanique's strategies for this novel. Painful antecedents refers to the history of colonization and imperialism that has dominated the lives in the Virgin Islands. Additionally, these antecedents, things that came before, corresponds to the literary references built throughout the book. She uses allusions of other examples of literature and folk stories to lay a foundation for this multi-generational novel. A novel of the U.S. Virgin Islands, Land of Love and Drowning keenly expresses the direct colonial role the United States plays in the Caribbean, a perspective that is often talked about or alluded to in Caribbean literature, but rarely the central focus, except in the case of Puerto Rican literature. The second part of the subtitle, Changing Futures, refers both to Yanique's resolution presented in the novel and her anti-colonial message of the text. The novel suggests that the U.S. Virgin Islands should have more autonomy and more respect from the United States. By using the present perfect tense, I'm suggesting that colonialism and our relationship with this territory is constantly evolving and will change in the future. I have not included the extra subtitle, Present Situations, because the novel really shows us the current impression colonialism plays upon the islands. Or as it is put in an interview, so these two things, what's happening politically and what's happening with this family, are tracking alongside each other in the novel. Indeed, Land of Love and Drowning is the it novel of today, a work that critics and literary scholars glow with enthusiasm and present interpretations on. I hope you will start to see some of this brilliance in this novel through this presentation. For this presentation, I want to lead you to see the context Yanique is writing from through some very powerful videos. I hope these will help to illuminate the novel. I also will provide some information about the Virgin Islands and the novel. Honored by many organizations, Yanique is one of America's most promising young writers. I would recommend watching several interviews she has conducted via YouTube to learn more about her. Land of Love and Drowning should be one in a long line of brilliant works from Yanique to come in the future. In many ways, the Virgin Islands, perhaps the most beautiful area of the Caribbean, have been used for colonial purposes since their discovery in the early 17th century. The majority of the native populations of the islands are of African descent due to the importation of slaves on the islands to work sugar. Currently, the population of many of the islands consists of foreign-born expatriates. According to the 2010 census data, there are 49,719 persons living on the U.S. Virgin Islands who were born there, compared to 56,686 persons living on the U.S. Virgin Islands who were born off the islands, with the majority of those from other Caribbean islands, 36,942, most likely to work in the tourist industry. Although this presentation concerns the U.S. Virgin Islands, I think it is important to show the proximity of the two other island systems, especially with several islands playing important settings in the novel. Indeed, for Virgin Islanders, there has been a traditional fluidity between the islands where people have moved around fairly easily. For example, Anegada is discussed in the novel as a place where women have special powers. It also punishes sailors with bad exploitive intentions. Anegada is surrounded by coral reefs that make it very difficult to navigate. The Spanish Virgin Islands, an obsolete term for the main islands of Vieques and Culebra, and the smaller islands of East Puerto Rico, are also mentioned in the novel. Now, these islands are administered by the United States through Puerto Rico. Sharing Spanish, these islands have a number of cultural similarities to Puerto Rico, including a slave history and Spanish colonialism. However, their dependency on tourism and their size makes them similar in a lot of ways to the U.S. Virgin Islands. In particular, these islands were used to boost the United States' military strength during World War II and the Cold War. For instance, there are sunken tanks and ships off the coast of Vieques and culebra, used for military exercises. The U.S. Virgin Islands have a unique history prior to the United States' involvement. They passed through various colonial powers, including Spain, England, France, and Denmark, which owned the islands most recently before the United States. The colonial powers imported slaves to work the sugarcane fields and mills across the islands. As we know from the musical Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton lived as a child in Christiansted, St. Croix. For the United States, the Virgin Islands are primarily a realization of expansion and colonialism. They served as a strategic measure of our efforts to secure the Panama Canal Zone in the early 20th century. On a symbolic level, they ensure our place in that long line of colonial powers that ruled these islands, making us newcomers but equals on an imperial stage. For the natives, however, living here can be a prison. To quote Rebecca from the novel, "But these islands are just too beautiful. We walk out of our front door into cathedrals. We step down your own stairs up toward an altar. God speaks from the bougainvillea bush from mountaintop. You go to the beach and swim in holy water. The beauty, like God's face, is ubiquitous and it is blinding." Yanique's religious comparison signifies the sacredness islanders feel about their environment. This spirituality often gets lost on tourists. This unimaginable beauty is simultaneously a blessing and a curse. Please watch the U.S. Virgin Islands unscripted multimedia series on the Caribbean Literature Watch List on my YouTube channel to see more impressions about the U.S. Virgin Islands from the tourist perspective. Please watch this Department of the Interior video from 1936. This video is included in the watch list for my YouTube channel. What is interesting to pay attention to is how the Virgin Islands are portrayed. Do you see any consistencies between it and the novel? How are the native people of the Virgin Islands depicted? Are they fully and robustly represented? Are they more than props? When do they get the entire focus of the camera? Why was this video made? How does the title contribute to our impressions of the Virgin Islands? The video on the right is of Lord Invader's song, Rum and Coca-Cola, which operates as an unofficial anthem of the U.S. Virgin Islands. According to the novel, the Virgin Islands are the rum and the drink, and the United States would bring the Coca-Cola. Of course, it is not that simple. The video on the left is the trailer for the film mentioned in the novel, Girls Are for Loving. This sexploitation film of the early 1970s uses St. Thomas as the background for this scandalous behavior of the movie. Just as Annette attempts the filming, many Virgin Islanders are simply props in the background. I think Yanique includes this film, although she sets it in a different time period, to show how little respect the United States has for the people. This table comes from the first U.S. Census report of the Virgin Islands from 1917. It shows the population in decline due to low birth rates and immigration out of the U.S. Virgin Islands, particularly to the United States. This decline is a double punch because a lot of women immigrated out of the islands, taking with them the ability to birth and raise children. The effect of this hurts population growth for generations. Antoinette, in Land of Love and Drowning, corresponds to this history, for she leaves St. Thomas for New York, finding it is not easy to make it in America. She returns defeated, deflated, and sick. This photo shows Charlotte Emily at the opening of the novel. The Bradshaw family belongs to the Creole class at the time of the transfer. Creole distinction becomes less important under American rule, for race replaces any alliances with language, culture, and/or social standing. Being black from the Virgin Islands ultimately is like being black in America. Yanique offers challenges to imperial ideology through her strong female characters. Yanique structures her novel around distinct sections: freedom, belonging, a belonging, drown, the bomb, and love, to mirror her characters' developments. Overlaying one device atop another, Yanique layers the events and people in the book to provide more significance than our initial reaction to situations. As a consistent strategy, it demonstrates that in the Caribbean, nothing is as it appears, or as one of the narrators remarks, but this is the Caribbean, and so no one is one thing, no one is pure. In this way, Yanique uses layering, or doubling, throughout the novel to present an anti-colonial message. She overlays characters and scenes with literary allusions from other Caribbean and African American novels to show the continuance of oppression and colonialism suffered by her characters. Specifically, the lead female characters at first succumb, then overcome dangerous experiences of patriarchy. Spanning 3 generations, the women in the novel function as extended metaphors for the islands themselves. In the end, Yanique presents the struggles of these women to represent the silenced history of the Virgin Islands. Men in the novel correspond with the colonial experience, and perhaps the patriarchy the women live under stands in for the paternalism the United States has for its territories. For example, Iona's life in St. Croix is trapped by Kweku Perdue, aka Benjamin Mackenzie. A variation of Wednesday in Ashanti, in the French for Meadow of Waters, Kweku Perdue claims ancestry on Anjagata, even though he has never been to Anjagata. In his renaming and mystery, he had become a myth. His octagonal house, like a spider's web, on the very edge of the island, also compounds his identity. His house's ceiling is made of webs, despite the absence of spiders. Kweku is the spider, a Nancy in the flesh, a trickster who controls and manipulates his prey. For instance, he gives her a rum and coke and takes her to his balcony. Once there, he has her. He brought her onto the balcony through huge, hushed glass doors. The ocean opened up. The breeze was like 8 hands groping gently at her buttons. She looked out at the ocean and felt warm and overcome. Perhaps she was inebriated. Perhaps she was in love. What is the difference? Yanique punctuates this passage with the ironic line, "She was free." Kweku replaces her father in his dominion on her body. This petrifying silver thing that Perdue was now cupping with his whole hand as though it were something he could break off from her and treasure away. His possession goes beyond her body. He must control her mind, demanding obedience and full submissiveness. And in order to stay alive as Kweku Perdue, the Anansi, he needed to hear stories about himself, needed to be the Malay. And in this way, he wasn't unlike other humans who find themselves unexpectedly in the Americas. Kweku is representative of American men, an entrepreneur who remakes himself in his own image at the expense of others, no matter the cost. Iona here must escape his controlling patriarchy to become a full self. To continue with another example of doubling, Yanique couples the arrival of modernity with patriarchy through the mythic restaging of a colonial invasion. In this book's exposition, an American businessman comes ashore with a little girl tied up with lace and silk. The relationship between the man and the girl is purposely never explained, for it is irrelevant for the situation at hand. Literally and symbolically trapped by this man, this little girl represents the oppression the female characters endure at the hands of men. Significantly, she is brought as a display to the white elite class, the Creole aristocracy of St. Thomas. She is a novelty for them at which to gawk and awe. This American man signifies the burgeoning American imperial state moving island by island through the Caribbean. This girl is a prop for his peculiar experiment. The American man hands the girl a glass ball and then whispers to her, "Do not drop it or I will punish you." She does not make a move to suggest she has heard. She only takes the glass ball in both hands. And then the first miracle happens. Her hair begins to rise. The storm begins to howl. A modified Van der Graaf generator, this glass ball shows how static electricity can be mastered, made heavily ironic by the raging tropical gale storm outside. This opening about this little girl, oddly enough, never returns in the narrative, yet it anchors the novel and operates as a foundational myth for how the book works. With the arrival of modernity through electricity, so too does patriarchy and oppression in another form, through the shining promise of American business and opportunity. Indeed, Yanique's omniscient narrator explains, the story will become more real than the night itself because the story of it will last, while this wet night will soon be over. And here we are putting it down so that it may last forever. Consequently, stories become more important than the actual events. Stories and their telling matter more for history than the facts. Yanique uses this opening scene to establish her narrative strategy of allusions and layering. Through the use of allusions, Yanique links this narrative to other ones from ancient, African American, and Caribbean traditions. For instance, the aforementioned scene with the bound little girl directly connects to Toni Morrison's main character, Florence, and her underappreciated Mercy. In that novel, a young girl has been purchased as a servant for an early American businessman. Yanique's use of allusion makes the novel fit into various literary traditions simultaneously. One thing that cannot be ignored in this novel is the sexual abuse. This abuse is fundamental to the work and needs to be interpreted carefully to understand the novel. For this presentation, I want to just mention one part briefly as not to spoil how the novel explores this subplot. Hearing the story of this little girl from her father, Iona grows to admire her. She has an affinity with the small girl because they share oppression. Shockingly, Yanique develops two incestuous relationships between Iona and her father Owen Arthur, and between Annette and her half-brother Jacob Mackenzie. These interactions, and that of the young girl from the beginning, symbolize the destructive forces of exploitative patriarchy. Yanique couples the young girl's story to Iona's through Owen Arthur's gaze upon them both. Owen Arthur could not help but watch the American girl with a father's tenderness. This little girl was pale-faced and blonde, and Owen's little girl, Iona, was honey-skinned and ocean-haired. But still he looked at this strange little girl as though looking at it on his own child. The first half of him desired that he had created this little girl. She was a pretty yellow thing. The lower half of him desired the girl. Owen Arthur's perverse thoughts and his criminal actions summarize his position as the dominant male in the community. As a result, he cannot see this girl's and his own daughter's victimhoods. Or, as the narrator proclaims, perhaps the little girl was, in a way, all women to him, as all women might be to a certain kind of man. Iona becomes the object of his desire. Owen Arthur thus grooms her with his seduction, isolating her from her mother Antoinette and alienating her from others. In this way, he stands as the quintessential oppressor. As a counter to the destructive forces of her husband, Antoinette, Iona and Annette's mother, tries to maintain power for herself. Antoinette alludes to the protagonist of Jean Rhys's Wide Sargasso Sea, a character who tries to develop an identity despite tremendous social and cultural changes surrounding her. Instead of succumbing to the physical restrictions dictated by her husband and society, Antoinette chooses to abort her pregnancies. For Antoinette, the most vital lesson of womanhood was knowing how to rid yourself of an unwanted child before it became a child. This ability grants her a certain amount of freedom in her relationship with Owen Arthur until she cannot rid herself of Annette. She also instills in Iona the myth of the Duna. Alluding to Greek sirens, Yanique uses this story as a counterpoint to the image of oppression that comes from the beginning. These mythic characters protect the islands. Iona recounts Antoinette's telling of the Duna. Mama never asked if I wanted to hear a story. She would be unassumingly sewing an accent upon her dress, and then she would look at me. She began with a female Duna who lived in the sea of the Anjagata Passage. They sink ships with their singing. They are tall, with thin, angular legs that push like fish through the water. On postures of their bodies, they have scales the colors of precious metal. This hides a bit of their bursting beauty when they come to land. Iona warns that the male Duna, who live on St. Croix near the city of Frederiksted, and are as chiseled as stones and as brown as bark, and they do not swim. Camouflaged with land, the male Duna are arachnids, like Nancy, the Caribbean trickster. Together they balance each other and protect the Virgin Islands and their surrounding seas. The Duna have backward feet to make it hard to track them. The Duna do not want us to follow them because they protect the wild things from our destruction. Finally, the women protect the sea, the men protect the land. This story, more real than actual, as the book proclaims, affirms that there are natural and spiritual forces beyond the corrupted people of these islands. Whether fate, justice, or the Duna, Owen Arthur pays for his crimes and the family disintegrates. The narrator explains his poor attempt of a mea culpa. Owen Arthur came to Iona's room. This was something he had not done since she had left the nursery. This was not a thing that fathers did. He didn't knock. He simply opened the door, and there was Iona, sitting at the edge of her bed in her flowing nightgown. He intrudes and admits that he has tried to find someone else to replace his desire for Iona, when in actuality, she finds a suitor to marry from Guadeloupe. Later in the conversation, he took her wrist in his hands and says, "We have always known that it is not the way of a good father or of a good daughter." He dies in a shipwreck the next day, on a day that had been bright and young. He gets his rightful place. As the novel develops its epic's perspective, it is the third generation of women, mentored by Iona, that offers the first major changes for society. Eve Yome is born to Annette and Jacob. Her name comes from being the first female child born to the Mackenzie family for Eve, and from dream to signify a greater goal. For perhaps what was ours was all a dream anyway, something to keep striving for, or something all in our mind depending. Yanique's choice in naming her Yome, a variation of a Japanese name Yomi, speaks simultaneously for inclusion and individuality. She will be representative of all Caribbean islanders, and she will be herself in all her glories and foibles. Consequently, Yome is instrumental in the protest called the BOM, Beach Occupation Movement in Bacchanal. While visiting a beach, Yome finds that it seems too good to be true. As the family walked out, Eve Yome noted that there were whole shells in the sand, things to pick up later and take as souvenirs, for they each had the feeling as though they were tourists on vacation, complete with that small niggling, as if they weren't sure they belonged. Even though they live surrounded by beautiful beaches, they've been conditioned to not appreciate what is around them. With the American transfer, the beaches become a commodity, as one hotel worker explains. Beaches that you were always allowed to go to were now brought up, and the white people were now disallowing you. Americans are always naming things after island things that don't make no sense. Sparked by her life and drive, Yome starts the protest and demands that our beaches must be free. The bomb spreads into a unique brand of protest. We were marching on the sand and doing wade-ins and soak-ins, and for those who could, swim-ins. Yome becomes the face of this movement, stripping her clothes to force people to notice the protests. Yanique makes Yome a living Duna, to offer a viable female liberation and a powerful anti-colonial message all in one. Yanique's description presents this power. She looked like something of the sea. Oh, she was something beautiful and magical that belonged to another world, or maybe to this very world, and all its magic. She becomes the embodiment of the newest generation of Virgin Islanders. They cheered for her and made way, like a school of fish, simply opening and closing as one body to accept their own. She was more than a hero now. She was a thing to drown for. Please use these sources to learn more about the Virgin Islands, the author, and the novel.